totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Author Marc Myers is back, this time to talk about his new book, Anatomy of 55 More Songs, the oral history of 55 hits that changed rock, R&B, and soul. Songs that sell the most copies become hits, but some of those hits become something more, iconic recordings that not only inspire a generation, but also change the direction of music. In Anatomy of 55 More Songs, based on his column for the Wall Street Journal, music journalist and historian Marc Myers tells the story behind 55 rock, pop, R&B, country, and soul gospel hits through intimate interviews with the artists who wrote and recorded them. Part oral history, part musical analysis, Anatomy of 55 More Songs ranges from Creedence Clearwater Revival's Bad Moon Rising to Dionne Warwick's Walk On By, the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations, and Black Sabbath's Paranoid. Bernie Taupin recalls how he wrote the lyrics to Elton John's Rocket Man. Joan Jett remembers channeling her rage against how she had been unfairly labeled and treated as a female rocker into Bad Reputation. And Ozzy Osbourne, Elvis Costello, Bob Weir, Sheryl Crow, Alice Cooper, Roberta Flack, John Mellencamp, Keith Richards, Carly Simon, and many others reveal the emotions and technique behind their major works. Through an absorbing chronological song-by-song analysis of the most memorable post-war hits, Anatomy of 55 More Songs provides a sweeping look at the evolution of pop music between 1964 and today. This book will change how you listen to music and evaluate the artists who create it. Marc Myers is a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, where he writes about music and the arts. He's the author of the critically acclaimed books Anatomy of a Song, Why Jazz Happened, and Rock Concert. You can hear Marc talk about that book in episode 31 of Booked on Rock. Marc also posts daily at jazzwax.com. He's a three-time winner of the Jazz Journalists Association's Award for Jazz Blog of the Year. Marc has put together a playlist of the songs that are included in his book, Anatomy of 55 More Songs, at his website, marcmyers.com. A link to his website and that playlist on the show notes page. Marc, welcome back to the podcast.
Eric, great to see you again.
Great to have you back on again, and this time we have you here for your brand new book, Anatomy of 55 More Songs.
Yes, that's correct.
This is a follow-up to the first one. When did the first one come out? Not long ago, right?
2016, and then Rock Concert was last year, and this one is this year, and that is correct. I do not get out of the house.
Yeah, we had you on for Rock Concert. That was the book that you had out.
That was a great interview.
What makes a hit song a timeless hit song? Because there are hit songs that fade away and are rarely heard or talked about as the years pass on. But then we have the hit songs that become much more than that. And as you're right, they inspire a generation and they change the direction of music. And you say a good time measurement approach is to give a song 25 years.
You know, you need the 25-year period because any Hall of Fame, whether it's Sports Halls of Fame or Rock Hall of Fame, there's a period of time that has to elapse. And that's to protect against you loving a song today that you think is unbelievable. And it turns out 5 years later, it stinks. You know what I mean? So in other words, you have to have a period of time in which an iconic song stands that test. Otherwise, we'd be, doing all kinds of, like the Macarena. We would be overjoyed. We got to do an anatomy of a song on it. Next thing you know, it's dated. So the songs can't be dated. And the songs that I chose, Eric, I wanted songs that weren't on the main highway. I wanted songs that weren't constantly in your head because they're in advertising now, or everybody sings them, or it's, I wanted it off the highway on a side road, meaning you knew that the reader knows the songs as soon as they see the title, but they look at the title and they go, oh, I love that song. Oh my God, I love that. I want to know the story behind it, rather than, man, I hear that thing all the time. Who cares? Who cares what went into it?
You worked hard at pushing the stories beyond what we've already read about these songs. And it really shows here. Can you talk about your interview strategy, knowing when and where to push for more information from an artist? Because I'm sure you tread in some sensitive areas at times. So how do you approach that?
I don't get much time with artists because they're busy. So if we get time, Keith Richards was 23 minutes. Others, short periods of time, some longer. But really what this is, what goes into this is I need to do hours and hours of research. I need to know everything that's been written about the song, because I need to know what's been said so that I can go beyond that. I need to know where the outer perimeter is, because my goal is always to go to territory that hasn't been dealt with before. And the only way that you can do that is by knowing what exists and pushing on those areas to get more information about those very things.
Well, the Donovan song was the first one I wanted to ask you about. I just kind of cherry picked some of the songs that I not only love listening to, but I'm just really curious about.
Yeah.
So let's start there. July 1966. Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones on this track. Half of Zeppelin.
You gave it away. You gave it away. Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, those guys are studio musicians. So Sunshine Superman has half of Led Zeppelin playing backup.
Then unknown.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny, right?
What did he tell you about those two words, like what they meant, what they represented? Sunshine and Superman, which, by the way, is the coolest title.
Sunshine is literally sunshine, and Superman is, Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the Superman. It's all heady stuff, all literature stuff from the 60s, but they work together so well. And Superman, sunshine, it's a wonderful combination of words. I mean, true artists, true lyricists, true musicians, the people who write these kinds of songs are just brilliant at coming up with word clashes, words that go together, and you don't know why you have an emotive reaction. You just have this wonderful sensation when you hear those two words together, but they're just two words, but yet you have all kinds of images in your head of sunshine and Superman, and it's an interesting combination of words.
It's all what you perceive it to be, but I always looked at it as that's the guy in the room who just lights up the room, and everybody loves hanging out with him, and he's just the guy. He is the guy, and he's the guy with good vibrations, like the Beach Boys song, right, from October of '66. Brian Wilson's genius on display here. The electro theremin combined with the cello.
And this song was originally supposed to be called Good Vibes. That's what Brian was calling this song, until Tony Asher, who gave him his first set of lyrics, said to Brian, Good Vibes sounds kind of like, it's corny. It sounds like, hey, right on, man, good vibes. Let's call it Good Vibrations. And Brian was fine. Brian was fine with that. But, invariably, he didn't use Tony Asher's lyrics for whatever reason. He liked them, but he wanted to see what Mike Love had. And the thing that's so crazy about that interview, or the information that I had gotten out of Brian when we were talking, also Mike Love, when I spoke with Mike Love said, I said, where did you write the lyrics to this song? And he goes, well, my wife and I were visiting her parents outside of Los Angeles in the Valley. And we had to be at the studio by 2:00, and we got into my yellow Jaguar XKE. Now, of course, Mike Love with the Beach Boys would be driving a yellow Jaguar XKE, right? So in '66, he gets into the car, and his wife, takes notes as Mike is driving. He's sort of talking about different words and different phrases, and the beauty is that he had a line, and he knew that excitement should be in there and vibrations should be in there, but it just didn't sing right. It didn't sound right. He couldn't quite figure out how to get them both in there. So he just pushed them really hard together and came up with excitations.
Brand new word.
Isn't that great?
That's 60s.
And keep in mind, that song starts with the repetition of one word. He opened that song, I, right? And you wonder, like, why, asking a dumb question, which I love to do, why two I's? Why did you need to say it twice? And he said, I wanted it to sound like the person singing was so caught up in the vibrations that couldn't quite get the words out. And he wanted the two I's together to sound like, the first one to sound like, I. He wanted it to have this excitation feeling to it, for lack of a better word that isn't really a word.
And Brian Wilson, man, he was putting everybody to task, right? He had to do like take after take after take.
That thing,
what he heard in his head, he had to make sure it was on tape.
Keep in mind, that single took months, and it cost almost $500,000 in today's dollars. you can imagine if the record executives had hair, they probably were bald afterward. You know, they probably just pulled all that hair out of their head. Like once they kept seeing the expenses come in. I mean, Brian had like the entire wrecking crew in the studio recording that thing day after night after day after night. But you know, he heard something in his head and he had to figure out how to get it down. And as you point out, that theremin sound, that ew, ew, or sort of space agey thing that's in there, he said if that were played alone, it wouldn't have sounded interesting. It needed a little more heft, a little more bottom heaviness. So he had a cello. If you listen to it, there's a cello sawing away underneath it, and those two together, that theremin and the cello playing, you know, each note of a 4-beat note, 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. You hear it sawing away. You suddenly realize, wow, that sounds so heavy.
So brilliant, that guy. I love the story about who's at the Don Randy was the keyboardist, the studio keyboardist, and Brian had him hold down the bass pedal on the Hammond organ for a long time. And finally, he's just like puts a pillow on the pedal.
And it just goes to sleep. Fell asleep until Brian finally woke him up.
He's like, yeah, that's it. You got it.
Yeah. But you know, it was like Brian was like like Dr. Frankenstein in that studio. I mean, you know, he could write music, he could articulate what he wanted, but he also had to communicate how it should feel, that there was a certain feeling he wanted, and that if he didn't get that feeling, I mean, you hear it on the YouTube things like, Hal, you know, play strong. You know, he knew exactly how he wanted Hal Blaine to drum on that song. And then it wasn't hard enough and he wanted it even harder, or he wanted the guitars to play this or play that, or, you know, he was enamored by Phil Spector, loved that whole density in the background. But then Brian sort of to that, you know, Phil Spector's wall of sound always had a sort of adult energy to it. You know, there was something very grown up about the Ronettes. You know, the Ronettes were kids, but you lost that love and feeling. But there's the strings and the Wrecking Crew arrangements are very grown up. You know, they just sound very, very adult. And, you know, Brian is a kid, and Brian's Wrecking Crew, you know, the way he instructed that Wrecking Crew to play was, you know, more juvenile, more adolescent. You know, there was an adolescent Peter Pan quality about Brian, and that translates all the way through the music, all the way through the arrangement.
I love the story Robbie Robertson tells you about the origin of the 1968 classic, The Wait by the Band. He sees Nazareth, Pennsylvania on a label inside the sound hole of his guitar, and that triggered thoughts of film scripts by Ingmar Bergman. I mean, it's like, what was
He's a big film guy. Robbie's huge on film. And back then he was such a film guy, he would buy scripts. Now, scripts today, a lot of times you can find them being sold on the street, or you used to be able to. Now, of course, everything's online. So if you type in Seinfeld script or Chinatown script, someone's put it up and you'll be able to look at it. But back in the day, you know, back in the 60s, you know, you really had to go to bookstores that managed to get their hands on what studios were going to throw out. And he went to the Gotham bookstore in New York, and there was a woman named Fanny who ran it. And for years, people could not understand whether they were saying, take a load off Annie, Manny, Fanny. That nobody quite knew. And I asked him, I mean, is it Annie or Fanny? And he said, it's Fanny. Fanny was the owner of the Gotham bookstore.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
That's
another stupid question. I mean, I love asking dumb questions. They always yield fascinating information.
I always thought Annie. Take a load off Annie.
Take a load off Fanny.
The 1972 song Roundabout from Yes is song number 16 in your book. Keyboardist Rick Wakeman had just joined the band, and he has a huge impact on this song. So many layers to it. And John Anderson, the lead vocalist, says, we can even hear Wakeman singing the notes to Three Blind Mice at the end of the track. You
can hear him playing those notes. But you know, the fascinating thing is they were driving down from northern Scotland to Glasgow, and they were driving through one of those national parks up there that are just, they look like the wilderness. I mean, there's a road traveling, if you've ever been in northern Scotland coming down toward Glasgow, there's lots of lakes. They're called lochs, Lochs, like the Loch Ness Monster. And they're very long lakes. They're thin, but they're long. and there's lots of trees and there's lots of density, and maybe you're the only car on the road. The roads are great. They're all paved and everything, but you really feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. And they're driving down, and of course they're stoned, they're smoking joints. And as they're coming down, all of the lyrics relate to that drive from northern Scotland to Glasgow. And if you read it, the Beyond the Lake, I mean, all of those lyrics relate to what they were seeing out the window. And the fascinating thing about the opening to that song, I really wanted to know, how did they create that sound? The sound that sort of rushes at you. It's almost like you're standing in the middle of the road and this thing runs you over, the opening note. And they told me that what Rick Wakeman told me, he held down an octave, E, the lowest E, and an octave up, and they taped that, him holding it down. And now with the piano, when you hit those notes and you just hold it, it's loudest at first, and then it evaporates. It slowly evaporates and is gone. And then they took that tape and reversed it. So you're hearing the reverse of that note disappearing. So instead of the piano, of you hitting the E's and that note being really loud and it fading, reversed, it's going from fading to really loud. It's coming at you instead of going away. And that's how they produce that sound.
And that's
old today,
school.
Of course, you could do it digitally or
right.
with synthesizers, but back then they only had certain things that they could use to do it. Even on a synthesizer back then, on a lot of the mono synthesizers, which only allowed you to play one note at a time, you wouldn't be able to do that. But to get that haunting, woody sound that is sort of rushing at you, it's almost like you hear a voice far off, and then suddenly there's a voice screaming right at you up close. They just reversed the tape. They took it and they put it back in the machine and they played it backward. And
this kind of book makes you listen to these songs in a whole different way again.
You know something? I put up at my site, marcmyers.com, marcmyers.com. I collected all of the songs, put them in order, and created a Spotify playlist for free. So anybody who's ordered the book, bought the book, or you just want to hear the songs or see what songs there are, you could go there. Now, if you can read every chapter in about 3.5 minutes, you'll literally be able to keep up. Like as you finish the first one, you'll be up to the second song and you'll hear it. It'll come on. You literally can keep track or keep pace with the Spotify playlist. Any reader can go there, sit in front of the fireplace, put that playlist on, and read the song while you're listening to it, and you will hear all the things that the artists themselves are talking about. That's the other thing, Eric, about this book. I went and got all of these interviews from these people. What does that mean? I did that for the reader. It would have been very easy for me to interview these guys and then write it myself. But I felt the reader who's buying this book should hear what I heard. So they can sit down and they can hear Ozzy talk about Paranoid. They could hear Donovan talking about Sunshine Superman. They could sit down and hear Deep Purple talk about how Smoke on the Water came about. So the reader as the reader's reading and listening to the music, they are basically reading the words told to me by these artists about the songs they wrote, produced, and recorded.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Maybe the best example of the magical chemistry that Elton John and Bernie Taupin had, Rocket Man from 1972. This might be my favorite Elton song, but that's like so hard to say because
it's a great power ballad. I mean, if you see Elton perform it, even the earliest performances, the way it builds and builds and builds, it's almost operatic if you listen to it that way.
What happens with Bernie when he's coming up with these lyrics? Because this is, again, we go back to old school days.
He's in his car. When he's driving in England. He's on the highway. He gets off the highway, and he's got about 20 to 25 minutes on these small roads. It's nighttime, and he's thinking about the song, and he's thinking of, he's looking at the stars, and he's seeing the stuff. It's very, very dark there, and he can see the stuff outside his car. And as he's driving along, he's starting to come up with lyrics for the song. Now, the problem he faced in the pre-digital age is he doesn't have anything. I mean, he can't write while he's driving, and he doesn't even have a pen to pull over and do it. He didn't have a cell phone to sort of do a dictation thing. So Bernie Taupin is driving through the landscape in England at night. The stars are out, and he's repeating the phrase to the opening 4 lines, actually, opening 4 lines, over and over and over again. And as he pulls up the gravel driveway of his parents' house, he turns off the ignition, bolts out of his car, rushes in the door. His parents don't know what the hell's wrong with him, runs upstairs, grabs a pen and pad, and just writes down what was in his head. The great thing about my interview with Bernie is that some of these were done by phone, but in the case of Bernie said, come on out, fly out and we'll talk about it. And I flew out to LA and we sat down for an hour and a half, and he told me the whole story, which I then share with the reader.
By the way, these are all interviews that you did for columns that you write.
Yeah, for my Wall Street Journal columns. The problem is for most people, they don't have access to these columns because they're all behind the paywall. Or even if they do, you can't really find them because some of them are more current than others. Some go back a couple of years, but I saved you all the trouble. All of these songs are now gathered in one book, and the music is all there on my site. And all you have to do is sit down and read the words of the artist. And here's the other thing. I have a short attention span. I can't be bothered beyond the point, or I just want to move on. If I open up an email and there's somebody's writing too much, I just close the email. I just don't want to deal with it. And I think a lot of people are like that. So I wrote this for people who also have short attention spans. And what do I mean by that? There are 55 chapters. Each one's devoted to a song. Some are 4 pages, some are 3 pages. And what does that mean? It means that the reader might want to start on the 46th song, and then they might want to go to the 3rd song, and then they might want to go to the 5th song and read the 54th song. So you could go in anywhere. You don't have to put that dollar bill in the book and say, here's where I left off, and then suddenly you don't want to read the book anymore, and it just sits there with a dollar bill on it. You could go in anywhere, read as much as you want, read as little as you want, and come in any place, and your attention span will never feel as though, I'm taking up more of your time than is necessary.
And you added one song that's not in the Wall Street Journal columns.
You're right.
Arthur Brown.
You're right. I had to do that one. It came up. Arthur Brown wanted to chat. Or I think he released a reissue of The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. And I knew that Fire was how shock rock started. I mean, shock rock starts with Arthur Brown and the Fire, and him wearing that crown of candles, lit candles, or fire shooting off the top of his head. And that's the start of theater rock, of shock rock. I mean, without Arthur Brown, there's no Alice Cooper, there's no Kiss, there's no Iggy Pop, there's none of that theatrical rock. Arthur Brown kicks that off in 1968 with Fire. So I had to interview him because I knew that if I didn't, he might not be around for the next book. And if I didn't capture it, the reader gets to read his words and gets to read the story behind those words. I wanted to preserve the history. As a historian, I mean, I have a master's in history from Columbia. It's not like I just like the past. I literally was trained on a master's level to do research and to preserve history. And for me, what's worth preserving, there's plenty of books on the Civil War, plenty of books on Lincoln, plenty of books on the Roosevelts. I felt that what was absolutely essential is to preserve this history of these songs, to show readers that this is a craft. It's like furniture building, that once upon a time, 2 people sat in a room with a piano and a pad and made up songs that became the music of our lives, that we just can't shake from our heads. That's magic when people do that.
Here's an artist who is no longer around, and he left way too soon. Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy. I mean, just so underrated here in the States. And you have The Boys Are Back in Town in the book, released April of 76. That dual guitar sound, classic. And there's some great stories in here. Chris O'Donnell, the band's manager, he inspired the lyrics.
It started because they were touring. And when they were playing Thin Lizzy, the manager noticed that the audience was made up of mostly working class guys, and that they had gotten off work, working in a factory, and that they were, suddenly being able to, they were relaxing and listening. They had a couple of beers and they were listening to some great hard rock, Irish hard rock. This is obviously in Ireland and Dublin. And the manager said, what you guys have to understand is, like, the people in the audience, they're all guys. I mean, the boys are here. The boys are here after work to hear you. I mean, that's your niche. That's your audience. That's where it's at for us. And that's really what inspired, the song "The Boys Are Back in Town." Also, there's more to it. Don't want to spoil it, completely for the reader, but it's just, you'll hear the song, and when you read this story, I mean, like, this is what I mean by by my style. First of all, my approach to these things, Eric, is I've taken enough screenwriting classes, film classes, to know how to write a screenplay. I don't write screenplays, but I know the architecture of a screenplay. And all of these, they're written so that you can visualize them. They open big. In other words, I set the stage in the introduction, then they always open dramatically, and they always close poetically. And this piece, and I don't want to spoil this chapter for listeners, but what a sad ending.
Steve Miller's story on Fly Like an Eagle from 1976 surprised me. I just didn't think of him as a political guy, but this is a song. He's making a political statement. There was an event involving Native Americans that inspired this song, right? Was it the Wounded Knee standoff in February 73? I
believe so.
Yeah.
They wanted their land back, and there was a big standoff. Yeah, I mean, the crazy thing about this is Steve was so early with the synthesizer, turning that sort of space age synthesizer, almost creating a concept album. This is like one song on this album where there's a lot of spacey synthesizer work. The most fascinating thing I think about that song is they were running short of tape the day that they were recording, and they grabbed a reel that had been erased. That they had to erase the tape, and the tape, when a tape is erased in the studio, it's like, I think magnets do something in a machine, and what they wipe it. Yeah, which is to wipe it clean.
In my early radio days, we took the carts, and if you made a commercial, you after it expired,
so you could use it again.
Yep.
And you'd take these tapes, and that's how you'd use it again. If the tape obviously had bad stuff on it that wasn't worthy. And what happened was that when they recorded Fly Like an Eagle toward the end, because they needed to splice on a little more tape, the magnet machine didn't do its full job. It left some grit on the tape. And what it left on the tape were these beeps. And it was like, beep, beep, beep. And they realized it sounded, what the magnet machine left on the tape sounded identical to what you would hear with the moon landing, with Houston talking to the astronauts. When you listen to those tapes on YouTube, and they're saying, Roger that, 7-6, download the 4-3. And you'd always hear in the pause, you'd hear beep, beep, beep. Even when they were on the moon, you got those beeps. I guess to let the computers know that there was still people on the line. I mean, I don't know why those beeps exist, but they did. But they suddenly realized that this song about flying like an eagle, that the magnet machine wanted in on the song, that it almost like created this sound effect so that the song would sound authentic about flying. It's just this wonderful, fascinating, poetic little bit that Steve Miller told me about those beeps that strangely come in there, but kind of make you think like the Apollo, the eagle has landed, that the Apollo has touched down on the moon.
It's cool.
Fascinating. And it wasn't planned. It was an accident created by a machine.
Marc Myers is our guest. His book, Anatomy of 55 More Songs, the oral history of 55 hits that changed rock, R&B, and soul, has just been released. Heart singer Ann Wilson shared with you the story of what inspired the lyrics to 1977's Barracuda. Now, here's another great example of you just going beyond what we already know. The story is pretty well known, but you get some raw emotion from Ann talking about this. The song was inspired by this rumor that the sisters, Ann and Nancy Wilson, were lovers.
Well, incestuous lovers, but
oh my God!
But what happened was that their label originally, Mushroom Records, ran this trade ad and showed them back to back, bare shouldered. I mean, it's really they're not without clothes. It's just that the way they cropped it, they're bare shouldered and they're back to back. And obviously they're both photogenic. But this record industry guy, I think it was in Detroit, in the Michigan area someplace, came up to her and sort of asked where her lover was. And She goes, what are you talking about? And he goes, yeah, from the ad. And back then, with the cocaine and the guys with the open shirts down to their navel over their jackets, it's a whole different mindset. And for a guy to come up to a woman and say something like that by today's standards is abhorrent, right? But back then, this guy felt, he could easily go up to her and make a comment like that and get away with it. And she was very upset. I mean, Furious. She was just very upset. And she went up to her hotel room and wrote a poem about, this lecherous guy, but put everything in code. And those were the lyrics. Those became the lyrics to Barracuda. But Tiger and Snake, they were toying first with Tiger, that the song would be called Tiger, but Tiger sounded too admirable, ferocious but admirable, and Snake just felt too obvious. I mean, it's just too, he's a snake, or that person's a snake. But Barracuda, 4 syllables, was perfect because it could cover a measure. It's 4 beats in that song. So Barracuda, both the image of a barracuda waiting and then diving on its prey, coming out of nowhere to jump on its prey, was just more ideal than Tiger or Snake. The other thing about these artists is that they are constantly on guard for a phrase, for an interesting insight, for a sign that has an interesting 2 words on it. They're always on the lookout for that, and they always put those things together. I mean, another example is Burt Bacharach and Hal David's Walk On By. Hal David came up with that line. Dionne Warwick said, he often came up with titles for her songs or lyrics for her songs based on stuff he heard, either in the street or in the elevator or while driving and seeing something. And you can just imagine, how David's like at the corner before a traffic light changes, and he's overhearing this conversation by 2 women. And one of them says, he didn't call me for 3 weeks. And then he showed up and I saw him coming toward me on the street. And I said, you know what? Don't even talk to me. Walk on by. And you could just see Hal David just pulling that pad out of his pocket and saying, yeah, walk on by. What a great phrase. Walk on by. Just jotting that down. That's covered in my book as well. How Burt Bacharach and Dionne Warwick recorded that song in 1964. That's a fascinating story.
You have one of my all-time favorite Steely Dan songs in here, Peg. I was so happy to see it in this book because I've always wondered if it had anything to do with Peg Entwistle, because I'm a classic Hollywood fan. So
the woman who committed suicide off the Hollywood sign.
She jumped off the high. So I always
nothing
thought
to do with it at all.
Nothing.
Both Donald and Walter were big film guys, big film noir guys, big literature guys, big jazz guys. But they just love stuff that's cheesy. They just have this affinity for stuff that's run down. So, really what this song is about, it's, as Donald said, it's kind of the reverse about All About Eve. Instead of this woman who is the star's assistant trying to get ahead and finally getting cast in her role and pushing her aside, it's about this guy who's an assistant, not an assistant, but the former boyfriend of a cheesy starlet who she sort of brushed off and broke up with. And now he's sort of standing there watching her at a photo shoot and sort of saying to himself, what goes up comes down, you did me wrong. And, now now you're going to be in 3rd-rate films. You're not going to be the big star you ever wanted to be. I mean, it's classic Steely Dan. That's the beauty of their songs. Once you get to what's going on in the writing of these songs and you get into their heads and figure out, all the run down old Hollywood, broken down old people who can't make it in the business and on the periphery of the business, they're spit out the bottom of the business, in Hollywood. That's who their characters are. And they're just wonderful characters. It's not unlike R. Crumb's characters or, John Waters' characters. I mean, they're people who wanted to be something and just didn't quite make it. And a lot of their stories are about the struggles that these people went through trying to become something and then coming to the realization that they're maybe not that special, but guess what? I'm special in my head, they would say. Deacon Blues, it's like, drink Scotch whiskey all night long and then die behind the wheel. You know, it's just this there's a romantic quality to that, don't you think?
Yeah. What a line.
I love interviewing Donald Fagen. I've interviewed him maybe 5 or 6 times. It's just a joy for me to spend time with him and to get a privilege, really, and to get him to talk about how Peg was put together, and then to talk to, I got to Michael McDonald to talk about how he created that 3-part background harmony on that chorus. And
what a voice.
Tom Scott on that interesting instrument, that electronic instrument that he used, that he blows as a saxophone, but it doesn't sound anything like a saxophone. So getting to all the players is important too in my book. I think where that is most pronounced, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but I think where that's most pronounced is on Donna Summers on the radio. She's dead. Obviously, she passed some time ago, but I was able to get to everybody who had something to do. I did this in my last book with Mercedes-Benz, obviously Janis being dead since 1970, but I got to everybody else who was alive, who had anything remotely to do with that song, and got such an amazing, I even got to Bobby Newirth, who has passed, but it was just amazing to get all these observations and put the story together. So in my book, in my new book, you'll hear the story of how On the Radio came together. And I got, to her husband, I got to the producer, I got to Giorgio Moroder, I got to the drummer on the session. I think there's 6 or 7 people doing the talking in there about every aspect along the way, chronologically, of how that song came together and how it became a hit.
The Car is My Best Friend's Girl from 1978. Here's an interesting one. Rick Ocasek says it's not about him, but it's something that he knew was relatable with teenagers. You get quotes from the guys in the band that it takes you right there as this song is being written and recorded. And there's a part of the story where they're all sitting in Rick Ocasek's basement with their instruments and amps, sitting in a semicircle. And there's Rick playing the song along with some of the others, I think, that ended up on that first album.
Rick never talked to anybody in depth about that song. I was able to get to talk to him about it, and he passed away. He suddenly passed away not long after. I'm so glad I was able to talk to him, get to know him. And he was so happy with how this came out. He was just like, wow, it's wild how what's interesting is that one of these guys once said to me, I won't say who it is, but the person said, "You write like we record." And I said, I kind of know what you mean, but talk to me. Tell me what you mean. He said, "You get the core story, the way we put down a rhythm section track, and then you overdub things. Then you bring in other voices or you create other sounds." He says, you put the rhythm track down, you get the basic story, and then you start bringing in other people who are involved to sort of give it more color and give it more life. It's exactly how we record. People, I don't mean to use a sports metaphor here, and I don't even follow sports. I began in the New York Times sports department, but I'm not a sports person, but this is the only way I can explain it. The people you see playing baseball or any sport are the most exceptional people of the exceptional people of the exceptional people. For everybody who's on that court, there are tens of thousands who didn't make the cut, and they're great. They can beat anybody on a basketball court in the street. And then below them, there are hundreds of thousands of college kids who are great, who never quite made it. And then there are other great people. And look, there's a whole strata. The people that you see on the field are the tip of the iceberg of those trying to get to those positions. And what makes them what puts them in those positions is because they're exceptional. They don't choke, they can field, they can do, whatever makes them exceptional, they're at the very top. These artists in my book are the same way. For every one of these, for Debbie Harry, for everybody who's always said, oh, Debbie Harry, she's just a pretty face, and everybody liked her, and that's because the way she looked, but her voice isn't as good as this voice. But I've interviewed her twice. She's immensely talented. She's incredibly smart. And obviously through Mark Chapman, she also is very fast to be able to write poetry or something to rap within minutes, to be able to have something like that and to be able to go in the studio and do it. I couldn't do that. I'm sure you couldn't do that. And I'm sure most people can't do something like that.
That's why I'm so fascinated with musicians, because I couldn't write a song to save my life. Here's an example, like Michael McDonald on What a Fool Believes from the Doobie Brothers, 1979. He's got some of the verses, but he needs some help with this. Okay. Kenny Loggins gets called. You tell the story, because I love when he pulls up and he's hearing Michael.
Well, Kenny
Yeah.
grabs his guitar out of his trunk, and he gets to the door, and the door is kind of open, like the screen. It's summertime, warm enough, June. It's so the door's closed, but it's a screen door. And before he can hear Michael playing, and before Michael comes to answer the door, Kenny's got the bridge.
Are you kidding?
He knows exactly what, and then they wrote the lyrics over the phone.
Yeah.
I mean, when you read it, it's absolutely startling. What's interesting is, I'll tell you this. I don't think I've really talked about this before. When I went out to interview Burt Bacharach years ago for another story that I did for the Wall Street Journal, I decided I was going to write lyrics and get Burt to play music. Like I wanted to understand what it was like to write a song with Burt Bacharach for this piece. And I spent an entire flight trying to write 8 lines. And it was hard. If you ask me to write a story, I can have that story done in a half hour. So writing's not a problem for me, nor do I ever have writer's block. But having to sit there and write a song that's meaningful enough that I can hand it to him and not have him crumple it up and throw it in my face, it took me like 6 hours to write like 4, 5, 6 lines. And when I got out there, I handed it to him at the end of the interview. I said, listen, I wrote these lyrics on the plane. What do you think? And he looks at it, the glasses come down to the end of the nose, and he looks at it and he says, well, I would probably move this line up. It sings better. I would change this word because that's not going to sing really well. It's going to be hard to sing. And I said, listen, I just want to hear what this is like. Can you sit down at the piano? Can you put music to these? And he looks at me over his glasses and he goes, what, are you going to make me work now? And I said, come on, Bert, I just want to get the feeling for this. But he actually went to the piano and he put words to these lyrics that I wrote. Now the lyrics are, I'm not saying I wrote a song, and I'm not even saying I wrote a song with Bert, but the process of writing lyrics for somebody that you're going to show it to, like Burt Bacharach, took me, and I'm a writer, and it took me 6 hours to come up with okay lyrics. Like, not even, like, I would say between okay and good. And he changed things around, and then he put music to it. But it's not like I'm going to collect a royalty check, because it's not going anyplace. But the reason I'm telling you this is it's hard. It's hard.
The process.
Everybody can, you may not be able to play an instrument, but try writing a song. Sit down and try writing a song. And no matter how good you think it is, hand it to somebody who really knows songwriting and see what their reaction is. It's a gift. Anything that requires talent. Painters, baseball players, songwriters, podcasters, and, newspaper writers. Those are all specialties. But, writing a song, very hard.
Song number 40 is 1979's Accidents Will Happen. Elvis Costello, he revealed to you that what he said the song was about in his book, his 2015 memoir, was not the truth.
That song is about regret. Elvis Costello was really, I think, angry with himself, upset with himself that he was so foolish to have engaged in infidelity in his first marriage, that his ego had gotten so big after he got famous in the late 1970s that suddenly women who wouldn't have given him the second look were looking at him, all the time. And he lost his way. And Accidents Will Happen is sort of a shrug. It's sort of a shrug. But what's interesting to me about that song is that song was inspired by 4 different songs. And this is what was fascinating for me when I was interviewing him, what came out of that, because I wanted to know, okay, what caused this and what caused you to write that? And what is that about? The sound that he was looking for in the chorus, Accidents Will Happen, what he wanted there, the inspiration for that was anyone who had a heart. Burt Bacharach and Hal David's Anyone Who Had a Heart by, Dionne Warwick. And he wanted that bell tolling feeling. the feeling of bells tolling. And if you listen to Anyone Who Had a Heart in that chorus, those breaks, it does feel like bells are tolling, like there's a tolling quality. And that's what he wanted there. He also was inspired by Randy Newman's I Don't Want to Hear It Anymore. Dusty Springfield sings that on Dusty in Memphis. That's where you can hear that song. But that song for him is, it's like, I don't want to hear it anymore. I don't want to hear about this. I don't want to think about this anymore, this infidelity stuff. Walk Away Renee was also an inspiration, which makes complete sense, because when you listen to Accidents Will Happen, it's ba ba da ba 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 ba. If you sing Accidents Will Happen, Walk Away Renee has a very interesting parallel. But it was the Walk Away Renee, not by the Left Bank, the original group, but it was by the Four Tops. That was the version he really loved. But what really killed me, as I said, here's another dumb question. I said, why did you start that song with the first two words a cappella? As you know, it starts, oh, right?
Yeah.
And then the rest of the song picks up. Then the instruments kick in. He was inspired, he said, by the Beatles' Girl from Rubber Soul, which, if you don't remember that song, John Lennon is singing that song, and he starts out by saying, it's a cappella. Is there anybody going to listen to my story? Right? But the first two words, is there, are a cappella. And he loved that, Elvis Costello.
Wow.
And that's the inspiration for him singing, oh,
Isn't that cool?
Yeah. And that comes from a dumb question. Again, I don't mean dumb for real. I just mean like a question that's so obvious, nobody bothered to ask it. But once I ask questions like that, they start to remember things they didn't remember before. And that's really my way in, which is to ask these questions that no one seems to have asked before, but seem so obvious.
Yeah. And so it was about his divorce, but in his book,
it wasn't about his divorce. It was about his infidelity.
His infidelity.
Yeah. And in his book, he actually fibs. I think he says that, he had a relationship with a cab driver, taxi cab driver, and then went to Mexico.
In Tucson.
He said it wasn't true. And he apologized to me. And I mean, that's not a secret. I think he made that pretty clear publicly, that was a fabrication in his book. And it was really there to sort of, I said, well, is it a real lie? Or he goes, well, it never happened, but it was one event that sort of stood in for multiple events.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. We'll finish out with some 80s songs.
Yeah.
Journey's Don't Stop Believin', that's a huge hit. And there's a story about Jonathan Cain's dad, and he sees him in concert that I love. Jonathan Cain's a keyboardist, and he's the one who really comes up with the song here. He gets things going.
Yeah, don't stop believing. Don't stop believing is a phrase that came from Jonathan Cain's father. Jonathan Cain, before he joined Journey, was not doing very well musically. He was in San Francisco. Things weren't working out. His girlfriend left. His girlfriend was paying half the rent. He couldn't afford the rent. I think his instruments were stolen. I can't remember the full aspect of it, but a whole series of bad luck events had happened to Jonathan Cain. And he was throwing in the towel, and he called home and he said to his father, I'm not going to be a musician. I've tried everything. It's not happening for me. I wish it would happen for me. I love this stuff, but can you send me money? Cause I got to come home. I can't, I'll pay you back. I just can't do it. And his father said, I'll give you the money, but you're not quitting. You're going to stay there. And I want you to fight and fight and fight. You cannot come back. Don't stop believing in yourself. I believe in you. You have to believe in you. Stay there. I'll give you the money, but stay there and make it happen. And Jonathan, as he's talking to his father, has the phone on his ear, and he's reaching and he's reaching and he's reaching. He finally gets the pad that's on the table, and he gets the pen, and he writes in the book, Don't Stop Believing. And when he's in Journey, they needed one more song for an album, which, as you know from reading this book and other stuff, it's like some of the best songs come when artists need one more song for an album, because they're suddenly under enormous pressure to deliver something in 15 minutes because the producer's waiting, tapping his fingers or her fingers on the table, waiting for them to come back, let's do one more. And, they need one more song, and he goes to his book and he sees the phrase, Don't Stop Believing. And that's what they do. The chorus doesn't happen. This is one of the only songs, I can't think of another one, but they saved the chorus for the very end. It's just this big buildup. And you don't hear Don't Stop Believing until the last the last minute of the song. It's not till way far into the song. It's about the girl who's running away and the boy who got on a train and he's going to West Coast, or he's going to Vegas. And Jonathan Cain was saying, like, well, why can't the chorus come sooner? And they go, no, leave it to the end. Neil's guitar solo on there mimics the chorus line. And Steve Perry was upset. He said, you're giving away what I'm about to sing. Why are you playing exactly what I'm going to sing? It's like you're stealing my thunder. And he said, no, I'm not. I'm actually telegraphing what you're going to sing, so that when it's like the overture to a musical, like they play all little bits of the song all along the way. So when he plays that bit and then Steve comes in and sings it, he's actually setting the listener up. He's giving a listener a taste of what they're about to get. And when Steve comes in and sings it, that power ballad aspect, that voice of his, the listener already knows it. I don't want to ruin it for the reader, because I know that your listeners are going to buy the book, because it's how could you not? It's just,
that's right.
Unless you were on Mars for the last 30 years, it's like, and you don't know any songs at all. But the ending is just so fascinating in terms of not only his dad, but how it winds up in The Sopranos and what happens at Jonathan's house at the end of it. But you got to get the book. Get it at Kindle or get it at Amazon. But each of these stories each of these chapters, each of these songs has an incredible kicker. What we call in the business a kicker, but the ending is this big twist.
Back to the Future, there's a movie that stood the test of time. And The Power of Love, Huey Lewis and the News. Here's a team effort here. Chris Hayes, underrated. He's got Johnny Cola's underrated too, man. Those guys.
It was a great band.
I mean, some great songs.
Yeah, if you listen to those albums today, like Sports, it's amazing how ahead of their time they were. There's just this freshness. I mean, it stands up. It still holds up. That stuff still sounds so upbeat and so. I mean, Huey Lewis is like the coolest guy in school, right? He's like the Fonz. There's something so classically cool about that guy. The way he looked on those pictures, the sort of athletic look. I mean, he's kind of like he's like the varsity quarterback who doesn't pick on like the weaker kids. Everybody loves him. Guys love him, girls love him. Everybody loves Huey Lewis, and he's such a wonderful interview, and he's such a nice guy. He wrote the lyrics to the song while going jogging. He went for like a 3-mile run, had the whole song down, and I said to him, this is another example of just a plain old question. And I said, well, how did you remember the words? I mean, if you're writing all these words as you're running, how do you get home and remember everything that you wrote? And he said, Mark, I remember words for a living. He said, I get on stage, I got to sing 30 songs. I got to know the words to the song. He said, my brain is conditioned to remember lyrics. When I'm coming up with lyrics, I remember all those lyrics.
So Bob Zemeckis, the director of the movie, says it's not peppy enough.
Yeah, the demo that they brought down to Hollywood, because Zemeckis is the guy producing it, and I think he's the producer or director. I'm sorry if
Zemeckis, I think, director, I believe
he's the director. Right?
Yeah.
And he calls Huey down for a meeting, and Huey shows up, and he doesn't know why he's there, because he's not a music guy, and this is Hollywood. And Huey lived north of Los Angeles, and he gets in there, and Zemeckis says, I want you to write a song for a movie. And Huey says, I don't write songs for movies. I've never done that before. It's too rigid. I got to follow a click track and make sure everything is, because it's not, I'm flattered, but it's just really, and Zemeckis says, I'll take whatever you want. I've got this thing coming called Back to the Future. And Huey says, let me stop you right there. We don't go back to the future. We're not an oldies band. We're not a bar band. Our image is different than that. So we're not going back to anything. And he said, well, then you just give me your next song. Whatever your next song is, I'll take whatever you got. So just write something. Just give me a demo. Let me hear what it is. And then if it sounds good to me, just go ahead and record the song and we'll use it. He said, the kids love your music. This film is about this demographic, this age group. And if Marty McFly had a band that he loved more than any other band, it would be Huey Lewis and the News. It's just perfect. So Huey says, fine. He and his manager leave, and they create a demo. He writes the lyrics on the run, Huey does, and the guys write, come up with a melody, and they come up with the rhythm track, and they send it down to Bob, and Bob sends it back, and he said, kind of like it, but it's flat. It just doesn't have any energy. I mean, if in the tempo, it just doesn't have the right vibe for the movie. So Huey hands this over to the guys, and they come up with that synthesizer, those stabs, ba 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 ba. Those really loud jabs, what the synthesizer guys and musicians call stabs. They're just musical stabs. Bing, 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 bing. And he had I think it was a Prophet 5. I can't remember the name of the synthesizer, but they come up with all this exciting stuff that goes on in there. And Huey does his thing. And it just becomes this runaway hit.
That was Johnny Cola's idea to come up with that stab. And he's the saxman, guitarist, vocalist, songwriter. And then Chris Hayes had a little jazzy chord structure there. Yeah, it's that song. I love Huey Listen to, so I'm just so
good on sports. Sports tomorrow. Listen to sports. Listen to the whole album, and divorce yourself from the nostalgia, because you're going to feel a nostalgic pull back to the 80s. But forget about that. Ignore that. Just listen to the music as it's constructed, and whether you like the songs or not. Not because they remind you of a time when you were younger, but just listen to the music because, is it good or not? And you'll be very surprised. I was very surprised when I listened to it that way.
All right, so I want to finish with the song that I'm so happy to see this in your book. Keith Richards, Take It So Hard. You could have put so many of his songs with the Stones.
Yeah, but this particular song for me, when I listened to it, there was a lot between the lines. I could hear it. And this came out at a time when the Stones were almost estranged. Mick wanted to try some solo stuff. It was in the contract, the Stones contract, that the guys could do solo albums, X number of solo albums. This is the mid 80s. Mick did one, and it was so-so. None of their solo stuff really got much attention. And Mick did a second one. I think it was when he did the second one, he decided he wasn't going to tour. The Stones weren't going to tour. We look at the Stones as like four brothers, right? And they looked at it as their livelihood. And if Mick suddenly wants his solo career and he suddenly doesn't want to tour with the Stones, if you're Keith Richards, you're saying to yourself, I'm going to be somebody's backup guitarist if this keeps up. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm going to be playing at the local Ramada Inn in about 10 years because the Stones are going to be gone. Mick's going to have his own career. The other guys are going to disappear, and I'm not going to have any identity. So Keith is worried. I mean, he's legitimately worried, and should have been. I mean, if Paul McCartney in 1965 decided, he wanted to become a fisherman, the rest of the Beatles would be worried sick. Who are they going to replace him with? Nobody. So Keith wrote this song, and Take It So Hard was really about Mick. It's about their relationship, and it's about him taking things too seriously. And what I loved most about this with Keith was, both with Keith and Mick, I've interviewed both. Once they understood that I was there to talk about their art, they became very emotional. They were no longer Keef. It was no longer Keith and Mick. These were now artists, and I could hear the emotion. I could hear the upset. I could hear, Keith was still himself, but I could hear him getting bluesy. I could hear him really starting to feel how Keith doing a solo album with his Winos group and coming up with this song. And it was so funny to hear Keith say, it wasn't until after this song that I had a really fine appreciation. I'm not going to do my Keith accent because you've heard enough of that. But he, imagine him saying this. He said, I really could appreciate, I had a fresh appreciation for Mick. He said, I sang one song and I was losing my voice as a lead vocalist. And here this guy was, I thought all he did was jump around on stage and I'm the guy playing the guitar. I'm the guy people are coming playing air guitar to. They're not strutting around doing what you're doing. They're thinking, I'm the guy here. I'm the guy bringing most of the sauce to the stage. And he's suddenly realizing, having this appreciation that singing isn't just singing, that it requires enormous ability. But that last question I asked him, which, came at the end of this, which is, do you think the Stones will ever record this song? And he goes, they could have had it. He goes, I wrote this song originally for the Stones, but when Mick decided to go do his own thing, I took this song into the studio for this particular album. And I said, do you think you'd ever record it? And he said, no. He said, the Stones are the Stones. This was separate. And it was just, wow. Yeah. I mean, it was just, for me, there's something so lonely about that. And so it's almost like the person in a car who swerves to miss a truck and just suddenly realizes they were almost killed, that, wow, if I had not turned the wheel sharply, man, I would have been right in the back of that truck. And you just got the feeling like that, thank God the Stones came back together. Like Keith was
really bummed.
Yeah, and he was like doing all these rock and roll, revival kind of things with Chuck Berry at the time. And, he easily could have slipped off into the mist, so to speak. If the Stones broke up at that point, they would have just been guys that got back together like 20 years later to revive things. It wouldn't have been the mega corporation that they are now, where they go out and tour and come back with $150 million.
And Keith does some really cool, the story about the lyrics, right? He does some really cool editing on the lyrics.
Keith, the beauty of a lot of these guys is that they have short attention spans. So they know when something's going too long, they know when something is get to this part faster. So after Steve gave him the lyrics that he had come up with, Keith took out a pen. I believe they were down at Island. Was it Island Records in the Caribbean? I believe they went down there. And Keith took out a pen and just went through this thing and went through it and cut out the stuff that, was just too much. But keep in mind, when Keith is doing work like that, he's not editing. He hears himself. He's playing guitar and he's saying, that's going to take too long to get to the chord. We got to speed that up. Or I'm going to play this here, but we're saying too much before I get to play that. So let's cut that out. He's just making that song tougher. He's making that song just more powerful by cutting things out that are keeping the guitar too far away from the action. And he knows that the guitar needs to be in the action. It's not that he's thinking about that egotistically. He knows what the listener wants. He knows the listener wants to hear the guitars, and that too many words, it's too much sugar in the sauce, not enough salt, so to speak.
Anatomy of 55 More Songs, the oral history of 55 hits that changed rock, R&B, and soul. So
Amazon, go get it. Get it at Kindle. Get it on Amazon. Somebody called it a literary jukebox, and that's exactly what it is. It's like pressing A7 or B6. You could go in at any point, fast, short attention span, and you get to listen to the music for free. And you're going to feel real happy after you read it because it's music you love. Eric.
All right, Mark.
Hey. Thanks so much for having me. I guess I have to get busy writing my next book to get back to see you, right?
Just so you can be back on again.
Yeah.
No, hey, you're welcome back anytime.
Happy holidays to all your listeners.
That's it. It's in the books.